Hello and welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Ali Mohammed with the Community for Justice and Equality Advocates. I have Dr. Jess Ghannam here with me. He is a Palestinian-American professor of clinical psychiatry and global health at UCSF, who conducts research on long-term health consequences of war on displaced communities and psychological and psychiatric consequences of war of war and armed conflict on children. He has been working in Gaza for 25 years, building community mental health clinics and also training community mental health providers for community mental health programs in Gaza. So I would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Ghannam. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, Dr. Mohammed, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So if I can just ask you, how has your identity as a Palestinian and a Muslim influenced your career in psychiatry and psychology? And has the intersection of your Palestinian background with your role as a mental health provider shaped your approach to your work?
I think that's a really good question. Because in our faith, intentionality is such an important aspect of who we are in our faith. And the idea of that intentionality and a commitment to doing good and to equality and equity and treating people well was and is a profound influence on me, and has always been a deep and profound influence on me. And the faith, together with growing up in a family that had been displaced from the Nakba, my grandparents being forcibly displaced from Palestine, along with my parents who were very young when that happened, the intersection of that kind of trauma for all Palestinians. You know, as Palestinians, we have that, and maybe we could talk about it a little bit later, that kind of trauma from the Nakba and multiple traumas since that time in our family and our faith and our larger extended community was something that was ever present. And when you put together a commitment and a deep appreciation and connection to faith with that trauma, and it gets all kind of mixed together, I think for me, as I was growing up, how to solve that complex interaction of all those things, I think I naturally gravitated towards the concept of wanting to help people. And I think, you know, many in our communities become health providers, become physicians, become healthcare workers, lots become attorneys and engineers also. But I think there's a group of us that feel like serving our community and serving others is one of the most important things that we can do. And I gravitated towards psychology and psychiatry, I think uniquely because of that trauma that I felt was, you know, in my family, in my community, in the larger community. And that kind of served me well, I think, in trying to solve all of the different factors that went into becoming who I am and what I am today.
Thank you so much. You know, I would like to ask you, before October 7th, Gaza had been under blockade since 2007. Can you kind of discuss the impact of the blockade on Gaza's healthcare infrastructure and give us a little bit of your background working in Gaza for 25 years and what you've done there and what that has meant to you?
Well, I'll tell you why I think that's such a good question, because I think the narrative and the kind of incomplete, if not ignorant, understanding of what's happening in Gaza right now goes something like this in the Western narrative, which is, you know, before October 7th, everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, this thing happened on October 7th. And the reality is actually very different. And anybody who's been to Palestine or who has been to Gaza understands the real painful reality. I mean, the reality is for Palestinians living in Gaza, they 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 have been under occupation for 75 years in some form or another. And then, as you said, since 2007, they've been on a total, complete siege and blockade, which you could say the words, but what does that really mean? What it really means is that nothing gets in and out of Gaza without complete and total Israeli control. I'm talking about before October 7th. So, for example, food, water, medicine, medical supplies, infrastructure for healthcare, all is tightly controlled by the Israeli military and the Israeli government. So even prior to October 7th, the living situation on the ground for Palestinians, especially Palestinian children, was actually very devastating. You know that prior to October 7th, 20%, 80% of Palestinian children were living on less than $2 a day. You had uh, you had stunting affecting the majority of Palestinian children living in Gaza. I mean, the Israeli government was so precise in its depravity, it only allowed a certain number of calories into Gaza, not enough for children and communities and people to thrive, but barely enough to survive. And the kind of health consequences of this were devastating, not the least of which was stunting, cognitive, developmental difficulties, physical developmental difficulties. And then in terms of just basic primary care, the idea of having a fully functioning hospital that could take care of primary, secondary, let alone tertiary care in Gaza was just not a reality. I mean, it's only been within the last 5 years that we even had, actually 3 or 4 years now, that we had the possibility of providing cancer treatment for children. That wasn't even possible for forever in Gaza. So the healthcare infrastructure prior to October 7th was always in a difficult position. If you look at the health inequities of Palestinians living in Gaza compared to, say, just what Israelis living just a kilometer away were like, the health disparities are massive. The infant mortality rate prior to October 7th for Palestinian women in Gaza was 18, and for Israeli women it's 2.7. And again, before October 7th. I mean, I can rattle off all of the numbers, but let's just say that the blockade and in fact the 5 wars prior to October 7th, in which healthcare infrastructure was also attacked, before, had a devastating impact on delivering even just basic primary care, let alone mental health care for that, which is what I specialize in. But even basic primary care was very, very difficult to come by. And it had a profound impact on the overall wellness of Palestinians, especially children in Gaza.
So I just want to touch on one thing that you said, that the Israelis were counting the calories of Gazans. What was the purpose of counting the calories of Gazans?
And this has all been reported on, well documented, and even the Israeli military brag, and the kind of extremists in their government would brag about this. And the idea of it was to never allow enough calories to come into Gaza so that children and their families could thrive. Because thriving means being able to have access to a balanced diet with a substantial amount of calories in order for growth and development. This is just common sense, common basic sense of nutrition. But what the Israelis did as part of their plan, and we'll get to that plan in a minute, was to never allow enough calories to get in to thrive, but just enough to live. So they didn't want the specter prior to October 7th of just starving people to death. They allowed enough calories for people not to starve to death, yet they did starve. We provided, in fact, a number of the organizations I work with, food supplement programs. And we would go to preschools and schools in Gaza and provide at least one hot meal. And this was so devastating for me to witness. And we're talking about 2009 when we started these programs, fair number of years ago, when these children who, when I showed pictures of these children to my pediatricians, they said, oh, they must be 4 or 5 years old. These were children that were 6, 7, and 8 years old. So stunted in terms of their growth curves. It was devastating. But the meals we would provide, the one warm or hot meal we would provide for them, for many of these children, was the only hot meal they would have in a day. And frequently, and this was, again, another sad story for me, some of the children would not even eat their food because they wanted to take it home and give it to their siblings. So children in Gaza, for many, many years prior to October 7th, really lived with food insecurity. That's really the best way to talk about it. Food insecurity, not knowing where their next meal would come from, certainly never or rarely having 3 meals a day, and being very anxious about when the next meal might come. And that's a creation of the Israeli government. We must be clear about that, because there's nothing that would stop tremendous aid coming in from Egypt or from the Israeli checkpoints. There's plenty of food to come in, but they were very careful about how much they would let in.
That's very unfortunate. Gaza, the people in Gaza are, as you mentioned, blockaded. They cannot move in or out of Gaza. They don't have any passports. And some people have compared this to kind of a not an open air prison. Some people have said in order to be in an open air prison, you need to have committed a crime, and have called it a concentration camp. How would you describe those set of circumstances, and how would you characterize the circumstances of Palestinians in this open air prison since October 7th? And the last thing I would add to this is the current situation unique from a historical perspective?
Really good questions. I want to just talk about before October 7th. I have consulted and been in prisons and worked in prisons globally. And the prisons that I've been in are much more humane than what Palestinians in Gaza have lived under since the blockade. And the blockade is a blockade, over of land, over water, and over in the air. Everything is completely shut down. The crime, Palestinians in Gaza have committed a crime. Their crime is being Palestinian. And part of the Israeli plan has always been to depopulate historic Palestine. I mean, their plan has always been to continue the process from 1948 to ethnically cleanse and remove any sense of Palestinian, Arab, Palestinian, Muslim connection to the land in Palestine. That's always been their plan. And they have engaged in that plan in a series of steps in Gaza that have been accelerated. And I'm still talking about October 7th because the blockade has serious health consequences and morbidity and mortality consequences. Would I call it a prison? As I said, I've seen prisons that have much better living conditions, and the crime is just being Palestinian. That's the only crime they've committed. Since that time, since October 7th, you're seeing, unlike anything in the modern era, since we have a historical record, the deliberate use of military force to target civilians, civilian infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure has created the largest IDP, internally displaced persons process in the history of the world in the modern era. There are only 2.3 million people in Gaza. It's probably the most densely populated place in the world. I can tell you that the density of the population centers in Gaza is intense. Right now, they're estimating that 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced from an already deeply densely populated space. So, in fact, they've been told to move from the north and to go south because it's safe, and they go to these safe corridors. But we know of reports, and this is even being reported by the Western media, that the so-called safe zones, the people on the roads in the safe zones, have been bombed, have been killed, have been shot. to be very clear and blunt about it, because the military extension of this ethnic cleansing in Gaza is being extended now to the south. There's literally no place that is safe for Palestinians. I've had colleagues tell me that when they've tried to leave from the north to the south, that they are just walking by, and it's like so painful to have to hear these stories, because they're walking by hundreds of dead bodies, and like the decency that we all believe that you should honor and have some sacred burial for those who have passed and who have died is not being afforded. You see babies, you see children, you see older adults who are just being left on the road to rot. And the amount of military tonnage that is being dropped on Gaza right now is more than was dropped in Afghanistan, is more than was dropped in Iraq in less than 50 days. It's almost akin to 2 nuclear bombs, is what some experts have suggested. The entire area of Gaza is in, and this is from the WHO today, this is from the United Nations, the head of the United Nations today, Guterres, said, it is beyond a catastrophic problem. It's beyond catastrophe. There's no food, water, or medicine coming in. People are starving to death, and they're being bombed. And this is really important, all under the watchful eye of the international community and their governments, who are standing by, bearing witness to a genocide of Palestinians and children and not doing anything about it. This is the crime. Like, in Islam, when we see something that is bad, we do something. We don't turn away from an atrocity. We will help the sick. We will help the poor. We will help the injured. But we are now in a situation where my friends and my colleagues in Gaza are saying, why is the world like not hearing our cries, the screams of our children? And this is something that we haven't seen in the modern era. The extent of a military campaign directed specifically at civilians, the number of displaced people, the devastation to the healthcare infrastructure, hospitals being targeted, physicians being targeted, nurses being targeted. We have never seen anything like this in the modern era. And there's no end in sight. That's the tragedy. And I really fear for the worst for my colleagues, for my brothers and my sisters in Gaza, that, and I say this to my colleagues here where I work, I say, Palestinians in Gaza are dying for us, and we need to do more. I mean, I say that every day. So it's a very grim situation. The international, I'm not talking about people, because there have been global protests. I'm talking about world leaders, and one in particular, the president of the United States, who has given the green light and given support for and has encouraged a genocide of a people, in the 21st century, is really unconscionable.
You mentioned the word genocide a few times there, and what's happening there is characterized by many genocide scholars as a genocide. However, I feel like there's some reluctance amongst some scholars and amongst some media personalities and in society at large to characterize this as a genocide. Where do you think that reluctance comes from, given the facts on the ground and everything that's being reported and everything that we're seeing on social media, that in my view kind of accurately fits the portrayal of a genocide?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I would say it's two things. One is that, and I'm just going to be very blunt about it, when brown people die, it's not genocide. When the scale and scope of Muslim people or brown people or people from the Middle East or people from the MENA region or people from the global South, when they die, it's somehow the calculation to go into, is it or is it not genocide? It's a different algorithm. It's a different kind of calculation. And so to me, it's bizarre that there's hesitancy to use that word. The other part of it is part of the Israeli propaganda. They have really precisely introduced this concept of, is it genocide? Is it not? To introduce doubt as to the severity, intensity, and depravity of the extent of the killing of civilians that is going on right now. Whether or not you call it genocide or not is really not the issue. I believe it's genocide. Experts believe it's genocide. Historians believe it's genocide. But there's this kind of narrative manipulation and introduction of some kind of doubt that is deliberate by the Israeli media and the pro-Israel supporters here in the West, who do this deliberately to kind of make people kind of have a doubt or a second thought about it, and to take away from the reality of what's happening on the ground. 16,000 people. Do you know what 16,000 Palestinian lives equates to in terms of American lives? Almost 3 million it would be like 3 million Americans dying. Like, if 3 million Americans were slaughtered in 50 days, would anybody hesitate to call it a genocide? No. But because they're Palestinians, because they're primarily Muslim, because they're Arabs, the kind of racism and Islamophobia and all of those kinds of things creep in to how it's portrayed, by the mainstream media here. Make no doubt about it. It is genocide. The intention is to kill Palestinian civilians. The intention is to ethnically cleanse and remove Palestinians. Israeli right-wing extremist politicians have been saying that. They call us animals. They call us dogs. They drop these bombs from the United States on civilian populations. Of course it's genocide. There's no doubt about it.
I want to kind of shift here to a similar topic. Around March of 2022, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and more than double the number of Palestinian civilians have died in less than 2 months, in about a month and a half, in Gaza, as compared to the Ukraine over about 20 months. Analyst Matt Duss, who's a former foreign policy advisor to Bernie Sanders, said about the U.S. political response to Israel's bombardment of Gaza. He said, as a Ukrainian American, I also stand in solidarity with people under occupation. The Palestinians are facing a much more powerful neighbor, the Israelis, who are in many ways trying to do to Palestinians what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine, which is snuff them out as an existing nation. Putin does not recognize Ukrainian nationhood. He does not see Ukraine as a legitimate state. Netanyahu feels the same way about the Palestinians. His governing partners feel the same way about Palestinians. The parallel here is between two peoples facing occupation, two peoples trying to secure their own rights and self-determination. Now, when this happened, last year, we're both stationed in the Bay Area, and I can remember every healthcare institution in the Bay Area, from Stanford to UCSF to Sutter Health, all of these healthcare institutions mobilized and provided aid to Ukraine, were protesting, and were advocating for Ukraine, which I think is a very commendable thing. But how do you explain the disparate responses from these institutions, from these healthcare organizations, expressing solidarity and support to the Russian to oppose the Russian invasion and illegal occupation of the Ukraine, from the Israeli invasion and illegal occupation of the Palestinians? What factors contribute to the differential response? And I'd like your view on that.
Yeah, I can tell you this is a battle that I do every day where I work at UCSF. And I can tell you many of my colleagues, we've written hundreds of letters to the chancellor. We've written hundreds of letters to the president of the entire UC system. We've written to our health system CEO, and we have said exactly the same thing. You condemned the atrocities in Ukraine. What is the difference here? And the response has been radio silence. Now, the moral bankruptcy of not condemning an attack on a hospital, not condemning attack on civilians, not condemning attacks on physicians, on nurses, on healthcare professionals, is so morally bankrupt that the explanation for it, we have to dig a little deeper. Because as the quote you mentioned from the aide of Bernie Sanders is exactly right. How is it that some people are entitled to support and resist a brutal occupation and entitled to world support, but others are not? Well, the answer, part of which is political, part of which is part of the racism that's involved in this. Some people it's okay to resist, some people not. Some occupations are good, some occupations are bad. Well, who decides that? It's power that decides that, right? And what has happened over the last 75 years is the attempt to really distort and create these false narratives of what's happening in Palestine and what's happening specifically in Gaza, right? The Israeli propaganda machine is very powerful and they're very skilled. And, you know, they don't talk about us. They don't talk about the West Bank being occupied, for example. You know what they call it? They call it disputed. So it's introducing doubt. The other technique that they use to try to make this different is they're saying, well, this is terrorism. We're just fighting terrorism. It's the war on terror. Well, that's what they said about Iraq. That's what they said about Afghanistan, right? And we know what happened when the United States and its allies went into Iraq and went into Afghanistan. It was a cataclysmic disaster because of the same kind of false narrative and analysis about, you know, why they did what they did. So the situation in Palestine, you know, we have to face this very painful reality that people with power, political power and economic power in this country are driving the media, are driving the narrative, are driving the foreign policy of this country in such a way that they're willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of Palestinian lives and 1.8 million Palestinians who are internally displaced and starving to death for some sort of political idea. So it's profoundly racist. It's profoundly morally corrupt. And that's the situation we're in. And what we are talking about with medical leaders, and I have lots of stories, like we've written letters to the editor at the AMA. They've rejected it. We've submitted, you know, contrary views, like why isn't the AMA, you know, standing up and denouncing the fact that hospitals and doctors are being targeted? Radio silence from hospitals, from clinics, from CEOs, from chancellors to presidents. And people are afraid. Think about what this world is, Dr. Muhammad. We live in a crazy world where if you say ceasefire now, don't kill doctors, don't kill civilians, you get accused of being anti-Semitic. And if you can understand that equation, then you understand why there's this discrepancy, this disparity, why it is that some occupations are good and some are not good, some we fight for, some we don't. It's because they've constructed this kind of nefarious narrative that condemning Israeli aggression is anti-Semitic. Condemning the killing of civilians and demanding a ceasefire is anti-Semitic. So there's this fear. And I know you've probably seen it in your workplace. I've seen it in mine. I've had colleagues come up to me and say, I really support what you're doing, but I'm afraid to speak. These are physicians. These are nurses. These are support staff. These are the janitors. They're coming in and saying, I really support you, but I'm afraid to speak. Well, when you live in a world where you're afraid to speak about a genocide that's unfolding before your eyes right now, something is desperately wrong.
Touching on that, how do you think medical professionals can overcome that reluctance to speak about such, I think, morally and ethically important matters to us as the bombing of hospitals, the targeting of patients, the killing and the kidnapping of doctors? How do we overcome that?
I think that's, and I'll say this to my community, our community. I say it to my colleagues at UCSF and everywhere else I work, that there has to be strength in numbers. Okay. So in the beginning, before people kind of saw the gravity of how bad things were, uh, people were kind of more isolated from talking about the blockade and the of Gaza and the occupation in Palestine and settler colonial violence and all of that things. But now things are different. We're mobilizing, we're building solidarity with our medical colleagues who maybe don't know about Palestine or the Middle East. And now we're beginning to shift. And the way I think about it, I'm not going to go to the CEO or the chancellor. I'm going to go to my colleagues and say, we're building this movement where physicians and healthcare professionals are committed to our Hippocratic oath. We're committed to our belief that we care for everybody and that the death of a civilian in one place is a death for all of us. You kill one doctor, you're like killing all of us. And I'll tell you, my colleagues really get it. And I've seen a change over the last month, I would say, where a lot of colleagues, a lot of my peers at UCSF were maybe reluctant to speak out. They're beginning to speak out now. So I think it's our obligation for those of us who believe in justice and who believe in health equity and health justice. It's our responsibility, and who know about what's happening in Palestine. We have to go to our colleagues, and we have to, what I like to say, it's change one person's mind at a time.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about the issue of hostages, and this is a very high-profile issue in the media. The Israeli hostages that are being held in Gaza. I think the other side of the coin is that there are a lot of Palestinian, they call them prisoners, but a lot of people call them hostages in Israeli prisons. And particularly children. And it's been reported that Israel has imprisoned many more people than it's released. Can you speak to the issue of hostages and how, perhaps one side is viewed as a hostage, but the other side isn't as much, and really what the situation is for Palestinians in detention and administrative detention and Palestinian children in that situation?
Yeah, that this is really an important point, and most Americans have no idea about. And I agree. I don't call them Palestinian prisoners, even though they're in Israeli detention. They are hostages because what happens is that they're taken, they're put into a military system, the military quote justice system. They're not afforded an attorney. They're not told what they're charged for. They're held without charge in this administrative detention, in some cases for decades, and they're not allowed to see their family. They're totally cut off from their community, and they languish there, and they're subjected to torture and harsh conditions. And this is true for the men, it's true for the women, and it's true for the children. And if you look at the history since 1967, 60% of Palestinian men have been under Israeli detention in some way or another. They deliberately go after Palestinian children.
Men, all Palestinian men, 60% of all Palestinian men
have been imprisoned at some point in their lives since 1967. It's an extraordinary large number, because what the Israeli military does is that they use that Israeli military to psychologically intimidate young Palestinian boys so that they won't ever resist. So they start young. They start going after them when they're 10, 11, 12. They will detain them. I don't want to say arrest, because when you say arrest, you have legal rights. They don't arrest them. They detain them. They take them. They put them through harsh interrogations. They keep them separated from their families, and they go through this system of psychological terror of trying to convince them that they should just, and this is the Israeli plan, by the way, what they're trying to do is get Palestinians to accept their fate as being occupied. It's been a catastrophic failure for the Israelis, obviously, but they use this form of psychological and physical intimidation to detain and extract people as a way to show how seemingly powerful they are. Now, it's kind of strange because this tactic, which has been around for 75 years and more aggressively since 1967, has been a catastrophic failure for the Israelis. I mean, if the intent is to subjugate Palestinians and get Palestinians to accept being subjugated and occupied and oppressed, it's not working. In fact, Palestinians are resisting more and confronting the settler colonial project more now and more forcefully than they ever have. But, it doesn't change the tactic that the Israelis use. And that way, the use of the word hostage to define the men, women, and children that are in detainment, that are being detained by the Israeli military in the West Bank, for example, is a good word because they are hostages.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghannam. Just kind of echoing what you mentioned previously, Jason Lee, the director of Save the Children in the occupied territories, has said the reality is that nowhere is safe in Gaza. Israeli orders to move are just giving people the option to die in another way elsewhere. And that there's no such thing as a safe zone in Gaza based off of what he's seen. I'd like you to, if you can, describe for us the mental health challenges before October 7th and also the mental health issues that are developing at this time, how people can cope with these conditions and what the lasting long-term effects from a mental health standpoint are.
Well, Dr. Mohammed, this is something that I could talk about for 100 hours. This is my area. This is what I've devoted my entire career to. And I'll tell you that, and I'm going to just do the short version, but prior to October 7th, we have this term in psychiatry, you know it, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Absolutely.
Well, what your listeners and viewers ought to know is that for Palestinians, and for 75 years now, there's been no post. We sometimes, and I've made this mistake too, using that phraseology to describe, what Palestinians are experiencing and what the children are going through. And, the symptoms may match up, but the term post implies that you've had a traumatic event, that it's resolved, and then you have a period of freedom or a period of quiescence, and that you're able to engage in a process of rehabilitation or healing. But there's no such thing as post for Palestinians. Since 1948, there's been a systematic and systemic attempt to use the settler colonial project to uproot, to ethnically cleanse, to kill, to imprison, to occupy Palestinians. And so you have a traumatic event like 1948, but that trauma never got resolved. It kept repeating and repeating and repeating. And so what you have for Palestinians, like if there's a Palestinian now, let's say, who's 10 years old, they may be now the fourth generation of Palestinians, maybe even five now in some families, from the Nakba of 1948, who have lived through hundreds, if not thousands, of traumatic events, settler violence, bombings, imprisonment. I mean, literally for Palestinians, trauma never stops. So the difference between what's happening now is that we might call it chronic traumatic exposure. I'm talking about before October 7th. Now, after October 7th, we have acute traumatic exposure, but it's happening 100 times a day. because the bombing is nonstop. The drones are 24/7. And I've been in Gaza, so I know that hearing a drone is terrifying because some of the drones, fire missiles. And so you never know if that drone that you're hearing is going to fire a missile. It's terrifying. So now you have acute trauma, but it's continuous acute trauma. If that makes any sense, I think to the physicians and healthcare professionals who are listening to this will understand it. It's like you're having an MI nonstop. It just never stops. There's nothing that's happening now that human beings have been through anywhere in the modern era where they're subjected to the possibility of imminent death every single moment that they're alive. And the threat of bodily injury, that's one of the cardinal symptoms of traumatic stress disorder. You get robbed or you have a car accident or something happens. It's a one-time event. But for Palestinians in Gaza, it's every single moment of their existence, the possibility of their death is imminent. And that's been nonstop now for almost 2 months. So it's a kind of trauma that is unlike anything we've ever seen in the modern history of psychiatry. It's just, there's nothing like it. So when you ask the question, what can we do about it? What I would say, if someone is bleeding, you put a tourniquet on immediately. You stop the bleeding. So the analogy is stop killing civilians, stop the bombing, let humanitarian aid in. There's a famous psychologist called Maslow, and he talked about a hierarchy of needs. Basic needs like food, shelter, nourishment. And only after the basic needs are met could you deal with the higher needs like psychological well-being, emotional well-being, things like that. So I tell people who ask me the same question, how can you talk about mental health support where people are starving to death or they're bleeding to death or they're fearing for their imminent demise at every moment? So the mental health intervention now is to stop the bombing, feed people, give them a sense of security and safety. That's the thing that we can do right now. And then afterwards, then we can talk.
Um, you know, touching on this issue of mental health, it seems almost selfish to talk about it for those outside of Palestine and Gaza. But with the advent of social media, you have all of these graphic images that people are seeing. And, it's been quite distressing for me. I know a lot of people have found it distressing. And I think that in these people, a lot of stress and anxiety develops. Can there be symptoms of PTSD?
Yes.
People outside of Gaza that are witnessing these images?
Yeah, that's really important to talk about for our listeners and viewers because there's something called PTSD by proxy or secondary trauma. And basically what's happening now uh, because of social media and you're getting bloggers and TikTokers and people posting from Gaza who are posting their own eulogies right now and showing you images of NICU babies who have died. Parents crying with unbelievable pain and suffering from holding their 6-month-old baby. That we're seeing those images nonstop. So I think many of us who witness those images, in fact, do have, it's not even PTSD because it's still not post yet. So I would say have traumatic stress disorder. They have insomnia. They have anxiety. They have depression. They can't quiet their mind. Many people can't go to work. I have my students at UCSF, who tell me, I can't go to school today. I mean, I have to take a week off because the word we use, they get triggered so easily. So what I tell people is that you have to be so careful about the social media that you consume because you can have the symptoms of PTSD or traumatic stress disorder just from the exposure of the symptoms and and this is really important, Dr. Muhammad. What we have here, because of the privilege we have of living where we live and the safety that we have this thing called survivor guilt, right?
Absolutely.
And that survivor guilt is very difficult and very painful. I feel it every day. I know you do too. And the survivor guilt is my brothers and sisters are being slaughtered in a genocide, and I'm here in this comfortable, privileged place, and you feel that sense of hopelessness and helplessness because you can't do so much. And that's really hard. That's really hard for our community right now. But the antidote or the treatment for that is engagement. And that's what I tell people. You have to be engaged. You have to make your voice be heard. You have to engage in something, whatever it is, letter writing, calling your congressman, going to a protest, whatever it is, doing a podcast. Staying engaged is the best medicine to go against the despair and the trauma and the survivor guilt that we all feel when we see our brothers and sisters in Gaza being murdered. So I just encourage people to, be careful about how much social media you consume and stay engaged, because there is a global resistance to this genocide, and a movement is being built, and we have to do that. We have to stand up and be heard.
I think 2 points. The atmosphere in the United States and maybe even abroad in Europe is that people are afraid of taking action and mobilizing, losing their jobs in response to social media posts or speaking out. I think for some people it's a difficult balance. But the other thing that I wanted to touch on, but besides consuming less social media and really kind of engrossing yourself in these visuals, are there any other coping mechanisms that we can use to kind of get over these symptoms?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the Western answer and then kind of a more kind of community answer. And the Western answer that I would give to people is you have to keep physically moving. You need some form of physical activity, because the people that I have worked with who are the most distressed are the ones who are, surgically attached to their mobile devices and can't get away. They even sleep with them. So they become physically inactive, and physical inactivity is really not good. In fact, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, when you're physically inactive, just flourishes. So there has to be some physical activity that you have to do: walking, going to the gym, something. Number two, you have to eat well. And a lot of times people maybe indulge and eat too much in terms of fast food, or they don't eat enough. And so there has to be, kind of a commitment to balanced nutrition. That's always good. And three, I would say a commitment to sleep. And we know that disrupted sleep and insomnia are some of the biggest contributors to these symptoms of distress. And getting decent sleep is absolutely essential. And then I think I'm going to go into our community a little bit. I think, community prayer, Jum'ah, for example, or having an opportunity to come together with your community and either pray together or commune together, coming together as a community, sharing a meal together, being together, and have that sense of community is probably one of the best things that you can do to mitigate some of the ill effects of all of the stress that we're feeling right now. And plus, part of what they want to have happen is for all of us to be isolated, because when we're isolated, it's easier for this project, political and military project, to continue. But when we come together as a community and engage with other communities, it can relieve our stress and it can empower us to continue to go forward. So yeah, I think in community engagement with one another and with other communities is really essential in all of this.
I think last question here, Dr. Ghannam, touching on that community engagement, we've seen a lot of really heartening solidarity from our Jewish brethren here in the United States, in terms of vocalizing, mobilizing, protesting in Grand Central Station and Congress, at the Statue of Liberty, etc. And it feels like there's some momentum in understanding of the issues that are at hand. Where do you see this going in the future? How do you see events playing out in terms of current events and the trajectory of where things are headed in the United States?
You may not want to hear my answer, but I'm actually, and I'm saying this in relation to my profound sense of grief and devastation, but the other side of me is actually somewhat hopeful, because there are anti-Zionist Jews in the Jewish community who are standing with us shoulder to shoulder, saying they condemn the violence, not in our name. We have people in the Latino community, in the African American community, in the API community, in the indigenous communities, all of which who are like embracing us right now in ways that I have never felt. And it's really extraordinary and it's amazing. And colleagues who are coming to me and saying, what can I do? What can I do? Which is really, it's a historical moment that we will look back on and say, this really changed things, like what happened in the Vietnam War, where these mass global movements did make a difference. And I feel like historically, this feels like the same thing to me, that this could really, really be something significantly different to cause the status quo, meaning unquestioned support for this racist apartheid state called Israel, which is causing so much damage in the world, that status quo can be changed and altered so that the United States will see that it's not in their strategic interest to have that kind of relationship with such a aggressive, destabilizing apartheid entity. So I'm kind of optimistic in that way. But for the foreseeable future, I think, I don't know how much into the political analysis you want to give. I think the Democrats, I hate to say this, have really shot themselves in the foot, because Democrats, like to be perceived as being on the progressive liberal side of things. But you look at the last 3 votes in Congress, a handful of people voted for a ceasefire out of 532 people. So you have Democrats and Republicans. And it's painful to see this as Americans, right? We look at this and we see, how can our Congress people not even come to the point of saying, stop killing civilians, ceasefire? They can't do that. So I think from that perspective, the Democrats are going to lose a lot of votes. It's going to change everything. That we're going to go through some difficult times, unfortunately, because of this. But my feeling is, why should you reward a president or a Democratic Party that supports genocide? And I think all of us have to look in the mirror when we go to vote or not vote and decide, it's going to be a tough decision. But if I had to make a political calculation, I think the Democrats are in real big trouble.
Dr. Ghannam, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This was really insightful and really helpful for me personally as well. I appreciate your time, and I'm hopeful that we can have you on again in the future.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Dr. Mohammed. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Take care.